underground. I suppose when you parachuted into Germany, you were with the Russians at the time.
When I was parachuted,
Yes, sir.
it was end of the war.
Yeah, well, tell us how it started.
It was I was a partisan in Slovakia.
I see.
And the Russian army needed people who speak a little bit or good German or some other language. So we were 2 Slovaks in January 45. We came over from Slovakia to the Russian army over the mountains in such as snow. And so we were at the 4th Ukrainian front of Marshal Zhukov, like a secret people. So we were trained into the radio, how do you call it? To send a message.
To send messages on by Morse code.
By Morse and so.
But they would parachute you into Germany for organized resistance. Is that correct? You jump out of an airplane?
Yes. No, we flew somewhere. I don't know exactly now, but I think it was a 15 April, end of the war, and we were shot down in DC-3. We flew from Krosno in Poland with Russian, and we were shot down over the Częstochowa in Poland, over the front line.
Yes.
In the night. But we were lucky, we jumped out, and we were saved from the Russians. And then we were driving back to Krosno, and 4 days later we were flown, and instead of Passau in Germany, we were dropped not far from Prague.
I see.
In the center of the SS training area.
Yeah. Well, that's nice. Well, tell us how you joined the AFEES and a little bit about your life.
I was born in the mid-central of Slovakia. My father, all my family from the father sides, mother sides were Slovaks, 100 years. And so my father was gamekeeper in Slovakia, in the central of Slovakia. And there I went to school, secondary school and so. And in 40, when the Germans split the Czechoslovakia in 39, we were very unhappy. And they were then under the, how do you call it, protection of Hitler, was created Slovakia, fascistic. And it was in March 39. And it was very soon, the Slovak fascists were very keen very soon. Not High Hitler, Nastraj and this, so. And my father was state, how do you call it, officer, or from state engaged. He was supposed also to go to this fascistic organization, but he did not do it. So he was thrown out. But we had also very good uncle. He was not fascist, but was very good in financial things. He was minister of finance in this fascistic Slovak state. He helped them, my father, to get back to his job as a forester. And so we were from the first days in underground movement. My father, it was very logically, because gamekeeper house was a little bit outside the town, and so they met the people mostly, I must say, from the Communist Party from Czechoslovakia.
Communist Party.
Communists, but also Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was 14 or 15, 15, no? So, and we were grounded. We have made also an secret, how do you call it?
A hideaway? Hideout?
Secret radio connection to Russia. And so I, for example, it was the hidden was the secret radio station. Once or twice in a week, I ran with the news about 12 kilometers in the night to this radio station, and then back into the school, into the secondary school in the morning.
You're a newspaper boy.
Huh?
Yeah.
And in 44, I finished secondary school in May, and soon I joined the partisan group. I saved, no, in our gamekeeper surrounding, not far, very far from our house, were jammed 4 Russian partisans. One was injured. And so we helped him. And so he was a, it is funny story, he was a chief of the staff or something like that, the man that, who was wounded. We brought him into the, he should not tell anything, he was, and into the hospital in my town, and I got his papers. And some week ago came another group of partisans from Russia, and I gave to this chief of the other group these papers of this injured, and he was chief of the staff. And they said the next commander from the second group, and now we have a new staff of chief, Milan Boros. I was 19. You know, they were times so silly. But so I started, really have organized group of partisans then it was July, in August, September, I organized a group of partisans. I had over 100 people.
Wow. What did the partisans do?
What we did?
Yeah, what do
We were blowing the railroad. We were also shooting the people, the Germans, and we were then so disturbing all the so they were very unhappy, the Germans, that we are there. And then in 26th of August or 5th of August, there were these outstanding in Slovakia. So then we were not only partisan, but we had already half of Slovakia without fascists or free. And we had also the very good airfield, military airfield from the Czechoslovakia and from Slovakia. We freed it, so we kept it. And so they could land also Americans from Bari and from Italia there.
You freed it, and we could use it for our airplanes.
Pardon?
You freed the airfield from the Germans.
Yes. No, oh, not only. No. It was Slovak. It was Slovak. They were not too many Germans at the time in August in Slovakia. They trusted to Slovak fascist government somehow. And they had much to do in Poland and in Yugoslavia and so on, you know. So they were some garrisons, but not too many. But then we have made this outstand. They came then. But we fled about third part of Slovakia, also with this airfield. So we kept it until the end of October. They landed many times, Americans, on this airfield, and they brought us the guns to Partizan, and they took the airmen who were saved by Slovaks. They were, I have here everything, the list of airplanes who were shot over Slovakia, and also the name of many, not everybody, but in here, for example. You don't need.
Wow, you, how many people? It looks like there's hundreds here.
Over.
Over 100?
More than 100 were saved or were saved over in Slovakia.
Boy.
Look here.
Dr. Boros. That's quite a list. You kept this list, or did you? How did you come by your list?
After the war, some historians and so they gathered it, and they wrote books about it. Here, for example, here you have. It is very bad. It is a crew of Americans. Here is Neil Cobb somewhere, and Madsen, Roy Madsen.
Are any members of AFIS here today that you helped save?
Until now I haven't seen, but mostly they are here. Tommy Thomas, Madsen, Neil Cobb, and some others. But I just came now.
Yeah. Well, tell us how you became a doctor.
After the war, I studied in Prague until the 52. I finished the school in Prague. I was member of the party, Communist Party, of course, partisan and so on. I got highest Russian.
Yeah.
And so I studied in Prague, and then I came to the capital of Slovakia, to Bratislava back, and I worked there as a surgeon. I have made surgery until 2 years ago. And as a communist member, I was nearly forced from the Communist Party to take care also, except of university hospital, about the special, very small, 15 rooms, or 10 rooms maybe, special only for the top people hospital. And so I was there very unhappy, but I did it. And in 65, it was already better in Czechoslovakia. After 60s, started a little bit democracy. And so in 65, was the patient in this special sanatory hospital, one who was the main Ministry of Justice or something like that in the years 50s, when they all communists killed. each other.
Yeah.
In Russia also, and over in Poland and so. And he was the patient, and next to him in the room was laying Husak and Novometsky, who were condemned from him to death. But they were pardoned. They were not hanged, as many of there. They were lying there. I could not stand this situation. I wrote a letter to the Central Committee of the party. Where is here justice or something like that? And they did not know what to do with me. After 2 weeks, here and there, please take this paper back and so. No. They gave me a passport and I must go out from Czechoslovakia, but with passport.
Yes.
It was in '65, it was already relatively good in Czechoslovakia, so I went out. And I wrote how it is possible that the murderer and his victim.
Yeah. That was funny. The guy condemned one to death, and they both of them were in the same hospital.
Yeah.
Now, you had a couple of famous, sort of infamous, maybe, patients that you were. There's a Chinese
Patient?
Who was
I knew Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh.
Was my patient.
Yeah.
Kadar from Hungary.
Mm-hmm.
After the revolution in '57. He was not patient, but he was laying in Bratislava. It is not far from Hungary. It was waiting there until the Russian stopped the revolution in Budapest. I was speaking with him daily.
What was Ho Chi Minh's problem? You remember?
Ho Chi Minh, you know, he was old and not very clear what it was my impression of him. He was very fantastic and idealistic. And also Raul Castro was
That's right, the Cuban brother of Fidel.
Yeah, Fidel. Fidel I did not meet, but Raul, he was a little bit critical against his brother.
Yeah. He didn't like his brother?
No, he did like it, but he said, oh, you know, I don't know, Fidel is maybe crazy a little bit, so, but in a fine way, you know,
yes.
Not so. Only he is overwhelming the things and so. And so I knew Khrushchev.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Wow.
Khrushchev. And I have met in the time when in '68 Russians invaded Czechoslovakia in '68 and has broken the democratic procedure under the Dubček. I was in Sweden at the time because I was pushed out in '65. And some 4 or 5 years ago, and in the '48, when the Russians invaded in the Czechoslovakia, I was in Sweden. And I was very good. I was already 2 years there. So the director of the sjukhus is Swedish, of the hospital. I knew him already. I asked him, Sven Alsen, he was name, please, can you do something against this invasion? So he arranged really a good, big manifestation in northern part of Sweden against Russia. And I was speaking also there, Swedish, you can imagine how.
Yeah.
After 2 years I was there.
How many languages do you speak, Dr. Boros?
6 or 7.
Yeah. You're one heck of a guy. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us? About your life, or about your, anything that comes to your mind?
Why don't we change tapes here and let Big get stopping place and we can carry on after that. I'm just about 30 seconds
Okay.
out.
Well, we're about ready to end up. I'll just end it up. Thanks a lot, and that's enough.
You don't need to take it all because it is a story of one. Not very interesting.
Oh, no.
It is so. Okay, help me. I want to thank Dr. Milan Boros for coming to AFES and meeting us in Wichita Falls, Texas. Dr. Boros, thank you so much for being
Thank you.
you. Okay, we're speaking now with Mr. Paul Kenney. He was a 22-year-old bombardier on a B-17 named the Salvage Queen. On his 12th mission out over Frankfurt, he ran into a little bit of flak. Tell us about it, Paul.
Well, the flak was not heavy, but it came the right place and knocked out our oxygen system. And of course, at 26,000 feet, we had to drop out of formation. And that means that you're a sitting duck because they'll jump on you. We had a running battle for, it must have been at least 200 miles. We got into northern France, northeastern France, when an FW-190 got us. We tried to, our pilot was a very good man, tried to evade being shot down by going down on the deck right at treetop level, hoping that the fighters couldn't get down that low, but they did. So rather than parachuting, he crashed, landed in a wheat field, beautiful landing. Never even dented the props until it slowed down. Did a nice job.
Did he put his gear down?
No, it was in February, and the fields were kind of soft. Yeah.
Well, now you
But plowed,
now
wheat
you
field.
need an airplane to destroy. What are you going to do now?
We didn't have any problem destroying it because it was already on fire.
Oh, it was.
Yeah.
Okay, what happened next?
Well, the pilot and I were old buddies, so we decided to take off together. And we took the engineer with us who had a shell in his leg. And he was in pretty sad shape, but we ran and got away. Hid out into a barn until dark. This was about noon when we hit the ground. Hid in this barn until dark and went into a little village and tried to get help at the schoolhouse. And these elementary schools over there, and many times, especially in the small villages, the teacher has an apartment right in the school. And we knew that most of them were friendly. It worked out beautifully. She helped us. We had the engineer with us, as I mentioned, and he was in sad shape. But she told us where to hide out in a cow barn just across the way. But she said get out before dark. Before daylight, I should say, next morning, which we did. We could not take him with us. He was delirious at the time and couldn't stand up, couldn't walk, so we had to leave him. Regretted doing that, but it was our job was to escape at that time, cause as much havoc as possible. So we had to leave him. Started out, we were only 500 miles from Spain, and that's where we wanted to go. We found that it was quite wet and hard walking in the fields because of the wet ground and so forth. We found this highway. This is for us. We started walking down the highway, you know, elated that we're on the ground and safe. And all at once, lights went on. We were on a German air base, walking down a runway. I didn't know it at the time. Well, we got out of there in a hurry. We hid in a barn nearby for 3 days before we decided it was time to get some help. Wanted to make sure that the place was safe, and it seemed to be. And the teacher, gave us 2 or 3 jugs of wine and a couple loaves of bread. So we had enough to eat on for 2 or 3 days. We were hiding in a barn that stored bales of straw, and they were stocked up several rows high. We went way up on top and moved a few bales and made a room there about maybe 8 by 10 or something like that, and it worked out fine. We saw this young boy, 15 years old, we found later, and after watching him for several days, for 3 days, we decided it was safe. So I went down and talked to him, scared him half to death. They took us in, got us in the underground.
Took you in and what?
Got us in the underground.
Oh, yes. So you were in the underground for a while.
81 days.
81 days. What did you do in the underground?
Well, I was helping some of the fellows who were trying to repair guns when the invasion started, and not much of anything. I studied French, and I'd already had a little background in it, so that helped. Nothing, just tried to survive until they could move on. The problem was, we were in the northeastern part of France in the Pas-de-Calais area, and that's where the Germans thought the invasion was coming.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, troops were echeloned back and arched from the from the northeastern France area. And the farther they got away from the coast, the thinner they were, but they were all over the place. It got so they couldn't move us any longer, and it stayed for about 5 weeks in one place, a little town. Safe, but dangerous. I was moved to a huge farm. Several men worked there, huge family. They had all sorts of guns hidden away and like that. I was there for about 2 weeks, and they came in and told me, we're going to take you to Paris. We've got a place for you. You can stay there until Paris is liberated. The guy came to get us, but he turned out to be a mole. You know what a mole is?
Yes, I know what a mole is.
Well, he took us right to the closest German roadblock, and we were POWs from then on.
And so you stayed POW to the end of the war?
364 days.
Hmm.
We were, after going through interrogation, well, the first place, they put me in solitary confinement for about 3 or 4 weeks. Interrogation, maybe they'd interrogate you for 5 minutes and then 2 hours. You know, at different intervals, just enough to aggravate you and disturb you like that. I didn't get much from us. We went to, and actually to an interrogation camp for Air Force people, separate from the regular Army. And just there overnight, and then went to Poland, to a prison camp.
You went to the Polish prison camp by rail?
In Poland, by rail. Mm-hmm. Yep. Interesting situation. At the time, it was in Brussels, Belgium. They put us in what I called third-class passenger cars, railway cars. And we went all the way the length of the west bank, east bank of the Rhine River, from its mouth up in Holland, Belgium area, all the way to Frankfurt, and never saw a building that wasn't destroyed.
Goodness.
It was absolutely unbelievable.
Wow.
No roof, no nothing, not a house would ever find any place.
War is hell, isn't it?
It was
Well, you
hell
wrote a
there.
book too, didn't you, Paul?
Yes. Mhm.
Adjutant's Call? Is that
Yes.
the one?
Mhm.
I've read it, and it's a good
Oh,
book.
did you?
Yes, I do. I have a copy of it in my house.
Well, you know, we didn't write it for you and other people to read. We wrote it for our grandchildren and children.
yeah.
But
Maybe I should unread it.
oh no, well, yeah, unread it.
I thank you for your book. I thank you for your interview, and anything you'd like to add.
Well, the Russians got pretty close to us there in Poland in January of 1945, and they evacuated us by foot in through the north part of Czechoslovakia and into a little town where they put us on a train and sent us to Nuremberg. We were at Nuremberg for about 4 or 5 weeks. They started walking us again toward Moosburg, which is in the Vienna area. Munich area, not Vienna, what am I saying? And it, on our way down there, they had 1,500 men with one guard. So this buddy and I escaped, went up in the hills, found this huge farmhouse, and we cased that joint. I use a proper word because that's what we did. We sneaked around that place and watched and looked. Not a soul there. So we went up to hide in the barn. There were about 20 guys in here, most of them Americans, said, "We've been watching you guys for all day. Why didn't you come in and see us?" You know? And that was interesting. We stayed there till we saw Red Cross trucks coming up from the south, which would be International Red Cross Sweden. And we knew things are pretty well over. So we went down on the highway, walked into Moosburg, and the guards were gone. And we started home from there.
That's a nice story. You're sort of one of the lucky ones getting shot
Very
down
much
and
so.
living to tell about it.
Yeah.
Coming home. And
Theoretically, you know, I'm not eligible for this organization because I didn't get back.
well, it's too bad. We're not going to kick you out of
Well,
it.
I figured you probably would.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I hope it works.
We're speaking now with Floyd Carl, who was a ball turret gunner on a B-17. Name of the B-17 was Rosie the Redskin. He now lives in San Antonio, but way back when, September 6, 1943, on his 11th mission over Stuttgart, what happened?
We reached the target. We bombed Stuttgart, and we were coming back. We got hit by flak, and it shot our horizontal and vertical stabilizer. Just about sheared a vertical stabilizer and a horizontal stabilizer on one side. And the pilot's name was Bogard. And he belongs to this outfit here, AFIS. And we just couldn't, and the fighters, we dropped out of formation, and fighters jumped us then, and it was 190s and 109s, Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190s. They jumped us and just literally shot us up, and so we had to bail out, and we bailed out over Chamois, France. That's south of Troyes, Troye. And Chamois was a little old town. We landed in when I bailed out, we bailed out at 28,000 feet. And I to this day, I never remember opening my parachute, but I did hit the tail wheel was down. And I hit that tail wheel with my shoulder. And I don't remember pulling my ripcord at all, so because at altitude I must have passed out. But when I woke up floating down, I still had my oxygen mask on. And this 109 fighter, he was circling me, radioing my position in. And he got so close to me one time, he come by, and he looked like he lowered his flaps and his gear and everything. Come right up to me practically, and looked at me like he was standing still in air. And that guy give me a big old highball. He saluted me, and I give him one back. And I remember I floated down to he was ready to my position. He followed me pretty darn close because it must have been maybe 2,000 or 3,000 feet, and then he left me. And at that time, I saw some trucks. It must have been German trucks coming when I was floating down. But I landed in a wheat field. I landed on my heels, I remember. And I had a British chute on, a breast chute. And instead of trying to, I didn't remember that it had a quick disconnect. And all I had to do was pull that little stop out of there, and then hit that breast chute, and I would have come right out of that chute, out of that harness. But not me, like a dummy. It dragged me all the way across that field down to a hedgerow. And that's the only thing that stopped me, was that hedgerow. Because I was trying to get it out, and then there I realized that all I had to do was hit that deal, and it pulled me loose. But the first thing I saw there was a big jackrabbit. And that jackrabbit was sitting there by that hedgerow. And I thought, man alive. And I had to go to the bathroom. First thing, I'm not kidding you, I really had to go to the bathroom. And that damn jackrabbit was sitting there, and finally I heard these trucks coming, and then I cut out. I don't remember if I got to the bathroom right then or not. I had to, but I run onto a waist gunner, Herschel Richardson. He's dead now, but he and I took off and went down to a big old hay mound in the middle of this one field, and we dug a hole and crawled in there. And these trucks come up there and circled all around that field, but they never did get out or look or anything. They just left us there. And I guess they thought, well, we done highballed out of there, but they never did come over and look in that hay mound. If they had, we'd probably been prisoners of war.
Well,
That's it.
You escaped then.
Yes, I escaped out.
Right now you're out in the middle of France and with nothing to do except try and get back. What happened?
We tried to go to Spain. That was our objective, was to go to Spain. And there was a lady, an old, on our interrogation, briefings rather, they always told us to approach an older person, preferably a woman if you could, because they couldn't fight back, or if you had to get away. So anyway, there was a lady, she was in the, elderly lady was in the sugar beet field. And we approached her and told her that we were hungry, we wanted to manger, And so she gave us the signal to stay down. She pointed to some woods over there and told us to go that way and stay there. So we went over there in these woods and we stayed there for a while. And pretty soon she come back. She was on her bicycle. She come back and she had a kind of loaf of bread, black bread, and a bottle of cider, and some cheese in a jar of some kind of jam. And she give us that, and we ate that, and then we took off again, and towards Spain. But it started to get cold, and it was in September. We ate some apples off a tree, and we walked all that night, and a couple more days we walked. Finally, there was an old farmer. We saw a farmer in a field. He was spreading manure on a field with a horse or donkey. I forget what it was now, some kind of animal. And I got up enough nerve to approach him, and he told us to stay there, and so we stayed in the ditch. There was a little stream there, and we stayed there for that night. He never did come back. But the next morning I saw him again, and damn if I didn't go and approach him again. I was sort of persistent, and he realized that I guess I was persistent. And so he told us to stay there until that night, and he'd come back and get us for sure. He'd give us some cock and bull story that he couldn't make it the night before, but he did come back and he took us down in his barn, and we went up in the hay mound and climbed up in there and went to sleep. And we slept up there the whole next day until that evening. The following evening, some lady come there, and she could speak English. She was a school teacher. And she told us to stay there and that she would, we told her that the guy never come back and give us anything to eat, or brought us anything to eat, and we were hungry. So she went and she got us some potato soup, and it had some rabbit in it. Everybody ate rabbits over there, all farmers at that time. I guess that's the only thing they could get. So we ate that, and she told us that she took us to another farm then. And when we got out there, the very next day that we got there and we were up in the hay mound, here comes this car, pulls up, and it was full of Germans. They were out there collecting food. They come to all the farmers during the summertime and collect. If they had any eggs, they took the eggs. They took whatever they could get and took it off these poor old farmers. But these people, they hid it under the ground. They all did. They dug holes in the ground and so forth and buried this stuff. But she gave us some eggs in, and we fried us up some eggs and something else and fed us there. And from there on, they took us to come with an old charcoal burner truck and got us in there and took us to a barn where there was a whole bunch of guys, and they all had, they were in the underground, but they were, all had guns, and they were ready to go, and they wanted us to go help them, work with them. And my pilot, Bogard, and a guy named Beach, who just died recently in Utah, Boise, Idaho rather. The two of them were up there, and they both had a burp gun or whatever they were there, and guns, and they wanted us to stick around with them. I said, I'm nothing doing. I said, you guys can do this if you want to. I'm going to Spain. I wasn't about to hang around there and get my fanny shot off. So we took off, Herschel and I, and this guy come and took us in another charcoal burner to Paris and put us up in an apartment up there. Stayed there for about a week. And when we got in there, this some guy come then later on, and he wanted us to go to Vannes, France. He took us to Vannes and by train. So we get on the train, and that thing was just full of Germans and everything. So we get on that train, and we can't say a word. We're in this little compartment. But we got through when we got in Vannes, the Gestapo was at the train station. There was nothing we could do but just cut right on. We kept on going. A little town outside of Vannes, France. And we got out there, and there was a railroad trestle, and there was something going on in the trestle, so Richard and I went out on the back landing, but the train was just jammed with people. They were just jammed. And we jumped off the train when it was just going slow. And then we went towards a place called Camaret over on the Brest Peninsula, and Douarnenez is another little old town. We're a fishing town. And we got there and talked to this guy. He had a fishing boat. We talked to him, and we tried to talk him in and take us across the channel, but he couldn't do that. We were, But this fishmonger, he and his wife took us in. Because this old boy that had the fishing boat, he knew them. And they took us up to their place, and their son was in England at the time. He was in the RAF. And they took us in and kept us there for quite a while, and another fella come from Camaret, and that's where Richardson and I got broke up. And he got to come back on a fishing boat. They stayed 3 or 4 days in the floor of that fishing boat, waiting for the Germans to let this fishing boat to go out to fish. And I was up in the place in Camaret in this little room up on top of, up in the attic. I watched that boat for 3 days with those guys in it. And the Germans would come around there, and they had a boat that they it mined, and these mines were floating on top, and they would pull these mines out and let the fishing boats through. They did that every morning, but this boat was still there for 3 days. I watched them laying. I knew they were laying under those floorboards. And they stayed there for 3 days, and they never go into the bathroom or nothing but in their pants. That's a fact. 3 days they were down there. So finally they let them out, and they got back to England. And they got back to England a long time before I did. So it took me 5 months. But I finally got back through a fishing British gunboat. Come and pick me up.
Billy Webb?
Billy Webb picked me up.
Here we got a Billy Webb again, Tori.
Billy Webb picked me up. I was the first person to ever go back on with 4 or 5 other guys. We were the first ones to ever go that way, to go back on a British gunboat in that system that they had.
Well, once you got to Billy Webb, you had a smooth crossing or a tough crossing?
Oh no, it was terrible. You know, when they went to the night that we went to Brest to catch this boat, and we went out, and there was a Canadian that took us out there. I know he was a Canadian because he had Canadian cigarettes, because he gave me a cigarette. He could speak real fluent English, and he was in the MIA or whatever it was back in those days, you know. I don't know what it was. But they, when he picked me up and took us out to the boats, there was 3 boats, lifeboats. The other 2 were dinghies, rubber dinghies. But we had a wooden one. It was a wooden boat. And there was 4 of us in it, Joe Kirk, myself, Gene Lawhead. They're both dead. All these guys are dead except me. And the guy that was in charge, the commander, he was from Tasmania. Big, big, big man. And he was just determined to get us out to that boat. And our boat had a leak. And it was a foggy night, it was terrible, the waves and everything. And I had wooden shoes. And I remember he told us to bail with whatever we had. And I remember I took those shoes off, and Bale was bailing the boat with these 2 wooden shoes that I had, and bailing that boat. And the other 2 boats never did make it. The 2 lifeboats never did make it to the gunboat. We were the only ones that did. And this guy was so big and so strong, he was rowing by himself. And he was really on our backs, man. He was on our backs to get that boat bailed out. And we finally got there and got on that gunboat and went to Land's End in England, in British Isles. And then they took us from there.
Well, that is really great.
It was.
That's exciting. And
Oh, I tell you,
slip out of harbor.
and he shot a man that night. He shot a guy that night
did?
too. This guy from Canada. I'm sure he was from Canada. I just say he's from Canada, but I know he was. You know. He shot a man that night. He said, anybody that doesn't keep up, that won't keep up with me and is noisy or makes any noise whatsoever, I'll take care of him. And he never said how he was going to take care of him. But he shot him. He had a silencer on a pistol.
Well, I was wondering, noise, I know a gun would make a lot of noise.
And that night it was a foggy night, and sound would really carry, see.
Yeah.
And he got rid of this guy in the back. This guy in the back was kind of a mouthy guy and liked to say what he wanted to say, and it was talk out of school, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And because the man never showed up after that, so
Yeah.
he did away with him.
I don't blame him. His life was on the line trying to help people.
That's right. But
Any other thoughts that you have?
oh, there's lots of thoughts, but it'd take so long to talk. I got lots of things I could say.
Well,
That I
I've been
did.
asking the others, what do you think of the helpers?
My helpers were great. In fact, my helpers come and stayed at my house. When we were in Savannah, Georgia, I took them back to Texas with me, and they stayed for me. I still hear from them, and I call them every once in a while. And I'm going over to France this year.
Who were your helpers? Name them.
Marceline and Pierre. Why'd you ask me?
Well,
I'll tell you tomorrow.
well, at our age, you know, it happens.
I just turned 82.
Oh, you know, well, we'll just put this off till tomorrow, but I want to thank you for a great interview, and
I was 26 years old. I was in the 78th Fighter Group, based at Duxford, England. We flew escort for bombers as far as we could go. I joined the 78th Fighter Group as a replacement pilot July 1st, 1944. Exactly 2 months later, on my 18th mission, I was shot down while strafing a train in Belgium. What follows is my own account of my great escape. Our 78th, do you mind if I read this?
That's fine, go ahead, sir.
You can amend this and blot out some of this, I guess.
Fine.
Our 78th Fighter Group, which then flew P-47 Thunderbolts, usually met and escorted the bombers as close to their targets as our fuel permitted. At that point, P-51 Mustangs from other groups, which had longer range capabilities, would take over and we would turn back. On the way home, we would typically break up into flights of 4, drop down to the deck, and search for targets of opportunity. As we knew that only the enemy had fuel to move about, our typical targets included automobiles, trains, trucks, and barges. On September 1st, 1944, we left Duxford at 07:30 and completed our escort assignment. Returning, we strafed a train, stopping it, then circled about to strafe the freight cars. On my third pass, I came in fast and low, training my 8 50 caliber machine guns on the rear cars with armor-piercing, incendiary, high explosive, and tracer bullets, shells. I had about 50 feet of altitude and was going at a speed of 400 miles an hour when the train suddenly exploded in my face. Flying through the debris, something hit my engine, breaking the oil line. With my oil pressure gauge reading 0 and the cockpit rapidly filling up with smoke, which did not clear when I opened the canopy, I knew I could not stay long with my plane. One of my fellow pilots, whose voice I did not recognize, called out to me, "Get some altitude." I immediately pulled up, stayed in my plane until the prop stopped. I then rolled the plane over and catapulted myself out into space. I found myself falling on my back, looking up while passing through a small cloud. I pulled the ripcord, opening my parachute. Upon landing, I found myself in the garden belonging to Mrs. Van Ashbrook, of whom I asked a drink of water. She gave me some coffee.
In return, I gave her my package of gum and my parachute silk being a prized possession for civilians at that time. I then ran into some nearby woods, which in turn became an orchard, a cornfield, and finally a garden bordered by a wall. Sitting down to catch my breath, I took inventory of my escape packet, distributing several small compasses in my pockets. After turning my leather jacket inside out, I climbed over the wall and walked down the street to get out of town. Walking as nonchalantly as possible in an attempt to be inconspicuous, I heard someone calling behind me. I saw a man in civilian clothes who was pointing a gun at me. Being unarmed, I decided to wait for him. He took me toward the river Dender and hid me in some woods. I soon found that I was under the protection of Mr. Adolf Triest, a member of the underground of the Svalbard area where I had landed. Mr. Triest brought me civilian clothes, which I put on. I wrapped my uniform in newspaper and kept it in sight from then on. Together we went to the town of Iddergem. From there I was escorted by bicycle to Bambrugge. Someone gave me a penciled note which said, "The carrier of this note will bring you safely to my home. You may trust him and be sure that we shall do our best for you. Signed, N." N proved to be Mrs. Nora Dorman, wife of Mr. Charles Dorman, mayor or burgomaster of the town of Burst. Both of the Dormans were educated at Cambridge University in England. While Mrs. Dorman spoke flawless English, I soon discovered that her husband had completely forgotten the language. After a night there, the Dormans were compelled to house 3 German officers, and I was moved to the home of Mr. Poney in St. Leven's, Houtham, where I stayed for a few nights. During this time, the German army retreated from the area, and the British army moved in. After the area was liberated, I was told to prepare to return to Burst and to change back to my uniform and wait inside the front door until all was ready. After much hurried preparation, the Poney family assembled and threw open the double front doors. It seemed the whole town was standing outside. My arms were soon loaded with flowers. A little speech was read, music was played, and a parade was held for me. Back at the Dormans, the news on the radio announced that any downed airmen were to report to authorities at the Metropole Hotel in Brussels. The following day, I was taken to the hotel, and the next day was flown back to Duxford in a C-47 cargo plane. I was the only piece of cargo. I will always remain grateful to those brave members of the Belgian resistance who risked their lives to enable me to avoid capture. In addition to those named above, Faye Gaston, Louis Korte, and Maurice van Derme were instrumental in delivering me to the Dormans. I was told that I had bailed out near the town of Ninove and that my P-47 came down near Pamel, a small village near Ninove. From Duxford, I was sent to London for interrogation. As I returned without being captured, I was 80 miles behind the lines. I was classified as an evader, given a VIP status, and returned to the States. arriving home on September 28th of 1944 to Kansas City, Missouri, where Wanda, my wife of 4 years, awaited. It says here, Ken's evasion was one of the fastest on record. He is most proud to be a member of the Caterpillar Club, whose membership is limited to those who have survived an emergency parachute jump.
Ken, that's great.
I parachuted on September 1st. I got back September 10th. I walked into my home in Kansas City September 28th.
Wow.
And I passed hundreds, maybe thousands of men waiting and hoping and praying for a ship to bring them home. And I was a VIP yet.
Well, Mr. Ken Dunaway, you did a great job for us, and I want to thank you so much.
Well,
Well, I'm Ralph Patton, and I was studying for an accounting exam on December the 7th, 1941, when the Japs hit Pearl Harbor. So I threw away my books and quit school and enlisted in the United States Air Force as a flying cadet, we called them in those days. And I was actually called to active duty in August of '42, and I graduated from flying school at Aldous, Oklahoma in May of 1943. I ended up as a co-pilot in the B-17 in Pyote, Texas, where we formed a crew, and then flew to Dyersburg, Tennessee for operational training missions, and went overseas in October of 1943, where I was assigned as co-pilot on a Crew 38 in the 94th Bomb Group, the 331st Squadron, stationed at Bury St. Edmunds in the southeastern England. On our 9th flying mission, we were bombing an airfield over near Bordeaux in southern France when we were hit by flak over the target. We'd been flying deputy group lead at that time when it was our 9th mission, and anti-aircraft fire put a hole in our right horizontal stabilizer that made the aircraft unsteady. As we left the target, we tried to keep in position on the formation, but it was obvious that the tail assembly was not going to take the vibration that was brought about as the formation descended from high 20,000 feet down to about 14 or 15. So we came off the target, lagging behind the formation, and she came up over the Bay of Biscay, and we were about 2 miles behind the formation when they crossed to the southern coast of the Brest Peninsula in France. Well, the Germans had an airfield station there at Lorient, and they sent up some FW-190s, and plus anti-aircraft fire from Lorient batteries that chased us all over the sky, and they kept firing, exploding off our left wing. And finally we had to make a decision to try to head home. So we made a 90-degree left to try to get away from the anti-aircraft fire, and the fighters hit us at the same time, and the entire tail assembly of the B-17 broke off at the tail wheel retracting well. I immediately climbed out of the co-pilot seat. My parachute was under the seat. I snapped it on the harness, dove headfirst out the escape hatch door, which the engineer and the navigator and the bombardier had opened, and I dove out headfirst and, spinning like a top, decided that I should watch to see if the ground was coming up before I pulled the cord. Well, I couldn't find the ground, so I pulled the cord anyhow and ended up with a cord in my hands and a parachute billowing over my head, which was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. And I could hear the dogs barking, and I could hear the whir of the FW-190 as it circled me, and I thought sure that he was going to come and take a shot at me or two. Fortunately, he was a pretty good egg, and he let me alone, and I landed. The parachute collapsed in a tree, and I landed on the ground in nowhere. Nowheresville, because I didn't know where I was. But in any event, I saw a couple of people standing in the doorway of an old farmhouse, a stone farmhouse. So I went up to them and tried to speak, and of course they spoke no English and I spoke no French. By that time, our first pilot and our bombardier came streaming across the field, so now 3 of us are together. And the 3 of us hid off into the woods and took off our microphones and our Mae Wests and tried to bury any gear that we thought would give us away, and then took off cross country trying to figure out what to do. We decided that we would go east and try to get out of the, we knew we were in the Brest Peninsula. We decided we'd try to get out of the Brest Peninsula and head south towards the Pyrenees Mountains. Well, the first night it started to get cold, and we watched a farmhouse for about a half an hour, and we saw 2 men, obviously farmers, coming in and out of the house, and so we decided to chance it, and we went up and knocked on the door, and the man invited us in, and there's a little old lady sitting there. She had been brewing a kettle of soup over the open fireplace. The kettle was hanging on one of these big cast iron arms over the fire, and the fireplace was large with 2 seats, one on each side of the fire. So we were able, the 3 of us, to get up into that fireplace and get nice and warm and cozy. The guy opened a bottle of wine and put some soup on, and one of the Frenchmen left, and the other one stayed with us. We couldn't communicate except by sign languages and by saying, yes, we were hungry or thirsty or so forth. But at any event, the man that had left came back in about 20 minutes and led us to another house. And there they put us up for the night and gave us a map and directed us to supposedly a monastery. And several eventful happenings along the way. We ran into a French gendarme, and we ran into a school teacher who directed us and gave us soup. We slept in a field that night and damn near froze. We tried to light a fire and couldn't get the fire going. And finally we just kept walking, and we're walking through a town, and 2 figures pop up out of the ditch. Well, we thought sure that they were Germans and that the jig was up for us, but as it turns out, it was our flight engineer and the navigator from another ship. So now we're 5 Americans wandering around the French countryside in broad daylight, as it turned out, and knowing not what to do. Finally, we come to a little village called Plouray, P-L-O-U-R-A-Y, in western France, in the province of Morbihan, the department of Morbihan. And as we circumnavigated the town, a little schoolboy was standing in the middle of the road. And we couldn't come back out on the road because we knew we suggested that he had seen us, and he stood there for at least 10 minutes. And so finally we decided, well, he knew who we were and what we were, so we might as well go on about our business. So we started on down the road, and as it turns out, we later learned that the kid was heading back for school after lunch. And when he was late for school, the teacher reprimanded him and wanted to know why he had been late. And she said, "Teacher, I saw 5 American airmen in the road." Well, she was flabbergasted, and so she turned her class over to another teacher, and she came looking for us. In the meantime, we had been picked up by a wounded Frenchman and taken to a basement of a bistro where they fed us a lot of wine and soup. And pretty soon we didn't care whether there was we didn't know whether there was a war on, and besides that, we didn't care. But anyhow, they kept us out in the field until it got dark, and then came and brought us back to the schoolhouse in the center of town. And they sheltered 5 of us for 5 weeks. And of course, there are a lot of stories associated with the residence of 5 strapping young airmen in the schoolhouse with a beautiful school marm. And one incident that I would like to record is that while we were 5 of us in the kitchen, the children used to bring eggs and meat and butter to the teacher as sort of a thank you to the normal. It was normal for that to happen in rural France. And some little child walked into the kitchen. 5 of us are sitting there, and he's bringing 2 kilos of butter for the teacher. Well, when he saw all these guys, I'm sure he didn't know what to think, so he went back to the class, and Tony, the teacher, knew what was going on, and she decided that she would get the best of us the one that could say bonjour in the best French to come in and say she would introduce us as her uncles from Paris. So another chap and myself went and knocked on the schoolroom door, walked in front of the school class, and the teacher said to the children in French course, "These are my uncles from Paris," and all we said was bonjour, and we hoped we fooled the kids, but I'm pretty confident that none of them were fooled, that they knew what was going on, but they'd been instructed pretty well, and nobody squealed on us. But in any event, Tony, the school teacher, knew and had contact with members of the resistance, and after 5 weeks at the schoolhouse, they split us up and moved 2 of us to a bistro and 2 of us to a hotel. And so 4 weeks later, we got word that we should follow the little Frenchman. He jumped into the farmhouse where we were hiding and said, "Allons-y, allez vite, vite." And boy, we really ran, and we got in a truck and we went to the little town of Gourin, and we missed the train. Well, he had to keep us. This chap was the barber in the town of Gourin, and he kept us overnight and gave us a haircut, and the next day we caught the train and went to the coast, to the town of Guingamp. And then we stayed 2 nights in a home there, and the Frenchman in a little gasogen, charcoal burning truck picked us up and took us to the northern coast in western France, where we waited in a farmhouse, afterwards became known as La Maison d'Alphonse. And the Maison d'Alphonse was a home owned by Marie and Jean Jaquel on the west coast, or the northwest coast of France. And we waited there, and there we met a chap who introduced himself, "I am Captain Harrison of the British Intelligence Service. You have now reached the most dangerous point in your mission, and we will not hesitate to shoot anyone that steps out of line. We will be going through a minefield. Anybody that steps too far right or left could blow the whole mission, literally." And so we did as we were told. It was a moonless night. We grabbed the coattails of the chap in front of us, and we followed about 2 kilometers from the Maison d'Alphonse to a cliff. And Captain Harrison said, "This is a steep hill, and you'll have to slide down on your butts and your backs, your bellies, or your heels, dig in close." He says, "If one of you slips, it'll take the whole line down with you." We learned that there were now 26 of us that are headed in this stream, Indian file, along the pathway, down the cliff, and we waited on the beach. All you could hear was the tide, the waves coming in. But after an hour's wait, the German coastal defense batteries opened fire and lit up the coast like daylight. And the big boom of the cannon just scared the daylights out of us. We thought after all this that the church is now out. But in any event, this shooting stopped. We waited another hour and a half, and there was a man standing up in the middle of the cliff with a little torch, as the British called it, a little flashlight, and they had various lenses for it. They had a blue lens if everything was okay. They'd put a red lens on if there was danger at the shore. But in any event, shortly, about 2 in the morning, 5 little boats came rowing in to the shore, and we climbed aboard these little boats, and the British sailors rowed us out. About 2 kilometers offshore was anchored a British motor gunboat, and it was MGB 502 of the 15th Motor Gunboat Flotilla of the British Royal Navy. Was a sight to behold. And we climbed aboard the gunboat and headed out. The roar of the diesel engines was both comforting and scary, because we thought sure that would give us away. But you can't imagine how sound does not carry against the ocean waves or the ripple of the current coming in. But on the route, we of course were put down in the hold. There were 26 of us and a French colonel, and the British sailor came down after we were at sea for more than an hour or so, and said, we have just learned that there are 6 German E-boats between us and the English coast. He says, you want to come up and see them? I don't think there was a man that volunteered. He said, we'll just stay where we are. But we asked, can we outfight them? He said, no, we probably can't outrun them either, but if we have to fight, we'll give them a good fight. But fortunately, all they could see were the searchlights of the gunboats. We evaded them, got back into Dartmouth, England about daylight, and from there on we were sent to intelligence for interrogating and so on. So that's the story. We were locked up for 3 days, interrogated by British intelligence, engineering intelligence, Air Force intelligence, infantry intelligence. They wanted to know about the bridges and the fields and the hedgerows and things in Brittany especially. And so I'll go on then.
Well, let me ask you one question, Ralph. Boy, that is great, what you've told us, and it's been so well organized. You must have given it before, and I can't praise you enough for what you did. But with the British gunboat, was that Billy Webb by chance?
Yes. Billy Webb was coxswain on the gunboat, and he was part of the shore party that went ashore to pick us up. And the irony of it is that they wanted 5 in the boat, and I climbed in one boat, and one of the British sailors swore like a trooper and hollered at me, "Get out, because you're too many of you in here." So I had gotten into that boat without even getting my feet wet. So he chased me out, and I finally found another boat that I could get in, but I got back with wet feet anyhow, and that's the worst that happened to me. So I'm truly not unhappy about that, but the saltwater ate my GI boots.
Hey,
But
thanks a lot,
Billy
Ralph.
Webb was quite a part of that crew, and the navigator on that ship was a guy by the name of David Birkin. Now, David Birkin was a movie director after the war, and his daughter Jane Birkin is quite a famous French chanteuse. And so we have had relationship with all of the people of the underground since that time.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Stay where you are, because we're going to get how AFEAS was started. And
Do you have a
You
picture of the flag?
wait just a second. Hold on. Just stop it a second. Turn it on, and Ralph, tell us about how AFEAS was started.
AFEAS started actually one winter night in 1953 when I received a telephone call from a chap that I had lived with for the 62 days during our evasion from Brittany in 1944. Lieutenant Norman R. King from Albany, New York phoned me, and he said in 1953, he said, "My wife Betty and I are going back to France to visit the people that we lived with during the war in the spring of next year. Would you and your wife Betty be interested in going along?" Well, I thought about that, but I called him back a week later, and I said I had arranged. When I returned from France in '44, I had taken the money that was back pay, and I had invested it in a war bond, and that war bond had matured, so I had $500. So I went to my dad and I said, "Can I borrow $500? And he said, "Sure, what are you going to do with it?" So I told him. He was very happy to lend it to me. So Betty and I, with the borrowed money and our cashed-in war bond, joined Norm King and his wife Betty, and we went back to France in 1954. Well, that visit was so successful that it stimulated us to save our nickels and dimes. We went back again in 1961. And in '61, that visit that culminated when the French leader of the underground gave me personally a list of 94 American airmen that had escaped from France the way I did. And I thought, gee, I took that list back with me. I was living in Buffalo, New York at the time. And I took that list back with me, and there was a chap there from Niagara Falls. So I went to visit him one day while I was over there on business, and I showed him the list, and he says, geez, he says, why don't we get a reunion of these people? I said, well, that's a pretty good idea. I can get the Frenchmen to come over, and I can find the Canadians that were the leaders of this operation, and I can get the group together. So I started to work on it, And this John Amory promptly moved out of town, and I've never seen him since. So I was sort of stuck with organizing the reunion in June of 1964. We had our reunion in Buffalo, New York. Now, at the same time, a Frenchman by the name of Leslie Atkinson was organizing a group of the helpers in France. So between Leslie and I, we were able to put together a pretty good reunion of the people that I had met in France in 1961, and it led me to Lucien Dumais, who was the leader of it was a Canadian, and he was the chief of the Réseau, as they called it, which is a resistance network, and his second in command and radio operator was Raymond Labrosse, who was from Ottawa. Lucien was from Montreal. So I was able to get the two of them, who had organized the resistance network, and Mathieu Branchou, who was from Guingamp, France, and he was the leader of the resistance in that area. So, and then I found out that one of the one of the interrogators of Americans in Paris was Anita Hartman, who lived in New York at that time. So we got Anita, who was a part of several networks, and we got Branchou from France, and we got Dumais from Montreal, and Labrosse from Ottawa, Canada, and they came to Buffalo, New York. And I sent letters out to all of the 94 airmen on the list that Branchou had given to me. And so we had about 75 people, and 35 airmen were present when we got together in June of 1964 in Buffalo, New York. And the men then decided that it was such a good gathering, and they were so happy to see everybody, that we ought to do it again. And one thing led to another, and we organized sort of like a social group, and we designed a logo, and we officially named the organization the Air Force's Escape and Evasion Society. And since that time, we've just been known as the E&E group. But anyhow, we then planned a couple of reunions in '67. We met with the Canadians, and they had a group of French and Belgians into Canada, and we invited them into Niagara Falls, New York, and were entertained at the air base in Niagara Falls, New York, or entertained them at the air base. And so we had helpers from Belgium, Holland, and France. I think there were at least 10 of them at that time that were our guests in Niagara Falls. Then in 1969, the Canadians and I got our heads together, and we organized the most fabulous trip that any of us had ever heard of. In 1969, about 100 of us went to Europe. We visited with the Crown Prince Bernard of Holland, and we had a cocktail reception with him, a stag affair, which the women resented very highly, but we went to the palace and visited with Prince Bernard, who was an airman, of course, and quite a very sociable type of chap. He had an American bar there for us with all the whiskeys that you can imagine. But in any event, we went from there to Belgium, where we met the King and Queen of Belgium, and the whole cabinet joined us. We went to France, where we met the Prime Minister, Marie Schumann, and then we went to England, where we had an audience with Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, and I personally met with her for, I'd say, about 5 minutes, almost one-on-one, which was all part of the experience of our '69 trip. Then we went back again in '71 and in '74, and then we invited 100 members of the resistance network, Shelburne, which was the one with the British Navy involved. The name of it was Shelburne. And we invited them on a tour of the United States. We entertained them in New York and Buffalo and Detroit and Pittsburgh and Washington, and then sent them on their way. And in 1976, well, no, we had the Belgians first in '74, I'm sorry. and then we had the French in '76, and then we had the Dutch in 1978, and we were in the White House with Jimmy Carter and presented certificates to the Dutch people. We had a spectacular ceremony at the Arlington National Cemetery in honor of the helpers who died helping American airmen. And so we have visited Europe, and we have visited helpers, and we have reciprocated in that, and we have brought helpers to our reunions. And in Washington, D.C., about 5 years ago, we had 62 helpers as our guests. And now we're here in Wichita Falls, and a diminishing number of airmen invite a diminishing number of helpers. But we still swear by our original slogan that we will never forget, and we don't think we have.
No, sir, we have not.
And thanks to you, this will be recorded.
And you have not. And Ralph Patton, we're so proud of you.
Well,
For what you did, and what you are, and what is yet to be. And maybe we can have another reunion like your '69 reunion,
boy,
God willing.
God willing, that would be nice.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your coming here and joining us and giving us an opportunity to record some of these stories. These stories are history, and they'll be lost. We have a collection on escape and evasion at the Air Force Academy Library, and all of the papers associated with organizing the AFES and anything connected with it, including junk mail, everything is in the library at the Air Force Academy.
Amen.
So there.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.